All right, so the intent of this talk is to help you configure your testing, I would say, infrastructure of your code to make sure like your tests have a clean database to run to test against for every single test. And that's kind of how you want to like organize your tests because you want each test to have sort of a clean slate when it starts. Um, so right now I don't have any tests in my code. This is this is a clone of the repo that you're working with. So the contacts starter repo, and I basically created a file. So I created a folder called test, and I created a folder called integration, and I have a file called contacts test. So if I go back, oops. So you'll see that I have a folder test, integration, and contacts test. And contact test doesn't really have anything, so it just looks like this. So I can use Mocha to run my test. Oops, test integration. So if I do this, I get a failing test, right? Because I'm testing true to be equal to false. So that fails. So everyone knows how to do this, right? The more interesting part is like I have a test here, which is like, creating a contact, and then I want to read the contact and then expect something to equal something. Right? This is usually what you do in a test, where you sort of create something and you read something, and then you expect something. You expect the read out value to equal to something else. The problem is that if I repeatedly run this test, um, I may end up with like a lot of data in my database, and I don't want that to happen. Or sometimes what would happen is that I rely on a specific value of something of like an ID, and that ID value keeps changing because my database keeps changing, and I don't get back a consistent value back. So sometimes it's really good to like have your database reset every time you run a test. And the way to do that is you can programmatically do that from your tests itself. So what is usually a good pattern is to create a different file called it's called like some sort of a test helper file. So inside my test folder, I will create a helpers directory, and then I'll create a file called db.js. Oops. So what I want in this, yeah. So what I want is this file is basically going to have a function that I can call, which will reset my database, and I want to call this function in every test. So I would want to basically say module.exports equal to some sort of a reset db, and then I would say const reset db equal to function, right? And what I want to do now is I want to like go in and talk to my test database and then basically run some queries against it. So what I mean by running a query is like there's a function. Has anyone used this function called truncate on a table? All right, so we can look it up.
Is it kind of like a transaction?
No.
Is it different than drop database?
Yeah, because truncate works on a table.
On a table.
So when you drop a database, you have to sort of rerun the migrations. So sometimes it's more easier to just like truncate a table, which is basically like remove all of the values of the table. So just delete all the rows.
Instead of
So-
dropping the table.
So drop. It's the same as drop table.
So drop table will delete the table, whereas truncate will just delete the data inside the table.
Oh, okay.
Hmm.
So it empty a table or a set of tables. And what you can do is you can also give it a restart identity, which is every primary key. I guess most of the primary keys which are set as serial will automatically increment when you insert a new row. But when you truncate a table, it will continue where it left off. So let's say I had 5 rows in there, and my current value of my primary key was like 6. If I truncate the table and I insert a new row, even though my table is empty, it'll start creating the rows at 6. But when I restart my identity, it will like reset it to 0 again. So that way it will start at 1 the next time. So this is useful when I insert some seed data into my database, and I have row 1 equal to this, row 2 equal to this, and row 3 equal to this. We'll see that in a second. So I'm going to use this function, this query. So in order to do that, I need to. So I guess everyone here is using pgpromise, right?
Yes.
So everyone knows how pgpromise works. So right now over here, I have this function, this file called database, and it's using pgpromise to connect to my database, right? And it happens to be this contacts here, and I can override this by database URL. So ideally, I would like to have a separate environment for my test, and I would have to create a test environment and a Devin environment, and this would read the right file based on which environment I'm in. And this has not been configured to do that, so I'm just going to skip over that part. So I'm just going to assume that I have a way to connect to my test database. So here, going back to my database function or file, so I'm going to continue to do this. So I guess I'm just going to, I'm going to continue to do this. And here, I'm going to list out all the tables that I want to truncate. So I care about truncating contacts, right? I think this application only has one table, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But if I did have another table, like if I had users, that would go in here, right? I could like continuously do that. And then what I want to do is I want to map through each of these tables. So I want to say tables.map table, and then I want to call db.none with truncate table table. And oops, this is and you can also say restart item. Oh, actually there is no table here, so I can just say truncate table name. So it's just truncate table name, and then you can say restart identity. So I want to do this, since it's a promise, it's going to be a list of promises, and I want to like promise dot outline them.
Great.
So that returns a promise, right? So now in my test file, I want to do this for each of my tests, right? So let's say I had multiple of these it blocks. So I had all of these, and in each of these tests, I was like, adding some stuff to my contacts table, right? And so basically for each of these tests, I want like my database to be fresh in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would want to do is I want to like use this function called before each. Has anyone used this function before?
Heard about it.
So I would want to reset the database. and I would want to call my function. So I would say I would import that file. I would say const db helper is where is it? Helper slash db, and then I would say db helper dot reset db. I could just return that. So does everyone know how Mocha handles promises? So do you know what the done function does?
To let it know when it's finished.
Right. And when I have a promise, the done is useful because the promise gets resolved at some time in the future. So you want to make sure that the test waits for that promise to finish and that promise to resolve, and only then exit the scope of the test, right? So for example, like here, reset db is a stateful operation. So which is why we're doing it in a promise, right? Here. So this happens at some time in the future because it may take a few milliseconds to finish, and I want to wait for that to finish before I start like running my tests. So that's why we have the done function. So I could then say .then, and then I could call done, right? But Mocha helps me remove some of this boilerplate code. But basically I can tell it that it's a promise, so I can actually remove this done, and if the function returns a promise, I could just return it, and Mocha would automatically know that it's a promise, and it would wait for it to resolve. So all of that boilerplate code goes away, and I could just return the promise.
So for all the places where we had done, we can replace it with
Right, so long as the last statement returned in your test is a promise.
okay.
Most of the time, the next statement is
Unless you're expecting it to be.
So the expect will happen, so it depends, right? Like, yeah, so if your last statement is a promise and then you're resolving the promise and saying .then, and inside that you're saying expect, it would wait for that promise to resolve. Right, so something like this. So let's say you had expect some promise. Right, this is usually what would happen, right? Expect data dot to be equal something like this.
You can put a promise.
Oh, sorry, there wouldn't be an expect here. It would just be some promise, right?
Yeah.
So this is usually how it looks. So what you did before was like you would have had a done here, and then you would call done here, right?
Yes.
But if you just return, then you don't need the done.
Oh. Okay. Nice.
Good for us to know, but I mean, I guess good practice to keep the done, so that way you don't forget it in case you do have something after the promise.
I would say like it's just much more cleaner if you don't have like the done. Like it's just like another like thing that you have to read. So this is like lesser code.
Yeah.
I think this is cleaner.
Sweet.
Okay. So cool. So let's see if this is actually working. So let's actually run this test.
Well, maybe the alarm is going off. Just trying to wake up.
So I also modified my Postgres database to log every time a statement gets executed against it. So every time something gets executed, it's going to show me a log. So let's see how that works. Okay. Okay. So for example, what I mean is, so if I have a PC pool minus t contacts, if I say select star from contacts, it'll show me that the statement was executed, right? So let's insert some data into this. So let's say insert into contacts. now we got 1. We have 1 value, right? So what I want to do now, I want to say Mocha integration contacts test.
It's freaking
So okay, so you can as you can see on the left, we tried to delete contacts, and then we tried to delete users, and then we got an exception that users does not exist, and then it basically threw an exception and it didn't really run the tests. So what we want to do is we want to get rid of this users here, and we want to run the test again. Cool. So this time it ran and our tests failed for a legitimate reason, which is like our expectations are wrong. Like we're expecting an empty object to equal to some actual object and true to be equal to false. Cool. So this is basically how you. So what's happening now is like every time you run your tests, your table is getting reset.
all the tables are getting. That's a good.
So right now only contacts is because that's the only table, but there's no reason why in the future if you have more tables in your application, you can just like add them to this array. So you can test that by looking at contacts and it's empty. It cleared it out, right? So I insert 1 and I select it and then I run my tests again, deleted it, it's gone. So it is resetting the database, or rather is at least truncating the table. So this is sort of a simulation of what an actual reset is, because it's not really robbing the database, but it's just like really efficient for your tests because all of the resetting and the truncating is happening from JavaScript itself.
So it'll be faster.
So it's going to be much faster, yeah, than if you were to do it from Bash, for example. You may have to like, for every I guess you will have to like call out to the shell and then do it. But you can do it, just becomes a lot more uglier. Like since you're already like used to having like a connection string and you already have a way to connect to the database from your code, you can just use the same connection object to connect to your database. And that's what you're doing here, right? You're basically using the same way of connecting to the database. Ideally, what I would do is I would also just export my DB from my actual function here. File here. So I would use the same DB. There's no reason for me to like duplicate this code here. I would have a separate file which is just like DB, which just connects to the database and exports the DB. And I would import that DB in all the files that I need to talk to the database. So this was just like a hacky way for you to do it. So I can probably try to refactor this. So let's say I have a database file, so I would call it db. I'll create a new file called db.js. Didn't let me do that. So cool. So here I would do this, and then I would just say module.exports equal to db, and then here I would say I would require db, and then the same in the test also I would require from2 require db, and this should work the same way. Yeah. Everyone with me?
Yeah.
Any questions so far?
Generally, for the reset DB, would
Mhm.
we run like a seeding function as well?
A seeding function?
Yeah.
Sure. It depends on like your application. It is sometimes very useful to have some seed data in your database for your tests. So that way you don't have to keep inserting and setting up your test, I guess your database and your environment with some mock data.
If you feel that you have, I mean, you've inserted the information into the database via, like the funnel thing. Is that equivalent? Like if it restarts it, will it if the database already had information in it and you truncated it, like I had two, it'll reset it back to those two lines.
Right. So
Or rows.
the question is like if you had like existing data into it, then how would your test? Since I'm resetting it, how would it have access to that data?
Or will it roll back when it truncates it? Will it roll back to the two things that were originally there?
No, it's just going to delete everything. So that's up to you. So I would, like for example, I would have a function called seed data here, seed db, right? And this would basically do some stuff like seed the database. And then I would have a function here called initdb, which would call reset db, and then .then it would call seed db. So just imagine this actually does something. So promise.new, what is it? Resolve So let's say my seed actually did some seeding. So in my test, where's my test? Here I would just call initdb. So my initdb would reset my DB as well as seed my database. So every time my test would have like the data that I expect, the initial data.
You wouldn't call any bash scripts in the C, or can you even do that?
So you don't need to call bash scripts because you have a JavaScript driver to talk to Postgres, right? Bash scripts are useful when you don't have a driver to talk to, but you're resetting the database from the JavaScript world. So you have access to the PG Promise library. So you can just do everything through PG Promise.
I guess that's what I'm confused is how would you funnel the information from the database?
So what do you mean by funnel the information?
I mean, in order to seed in the bash script, I've always done like PSQL less than and the name of the file that I'm trying to load.
Oh, I see. So you're seeding from a file.
Yeah.
Sure. Or you can you can also do like a raw query. So I think the PG Promise supports like raw queries.
I think you should use that. That's to load that SQL file.
Oh. Yeah. From that, right?
I see what you mean. So like you had like a .SQL file which has like a bunch of like data in it, and you just want to like load that file.
Yeah, without a bash script.
Would we even need that if we have like this?
That's like because testing is supposed to be different than what your actual stuff is.
But I mean, you also wouldn't seed a production database, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, in production you wouldn't have any seed data. Everything would actually come from either somebody performing some activities on your website.
And since we're resetting the database after or before each test in our test database, we wouldn't need any basically .SQL files with seed data in our root directories anymore. Right?
I mean, there's no reason why you can't. You can still load your database with a SQL file. So you can do it in two ways, right? Like you can like write individually, like these are the different like rows that I want to insert. So like for example, in my CDB file, I would say something like db dot. Is there an insert function on pgpromise? Insert
Ross.
query. Okay. db.query. I would say insert into contacts. What is it? First and last? First name, last name.
Underscore first.
I could do this, right? And I could do like multiple of these, and I could say dot 10, and then I could do the same thing again. Oops.
Oh yeah, I'm just gonna issue a different PR. I know there's a flags you can get around.
So something like, so I could keep doing this, right, and like load it individually, or as you said, I could like read a file, or as Sarafin was suggesting, like you could just read the file, and then whatever the content or the contents of the file is, you can just like load that as a raw query, and it'll just evaluate all of those, all that SQL. This is an implicit return, so I don't need to put a return statement. Okay. Questions? Does this make sense? Yeah, Sarafin.
What if you, in continuously integrating, you add a new feature, but you have a live something on going right now? How do you take like maybe you need to run a test on actual production values? Do you just copy those off of the production database, move it into your testing, run your tests on that?
So the question is like if you have data in your production database that you want to use in your testing, yeah, you could take like a backup of the production database.
You just have to copy it, but you wouldn't be able to do that like continuously.
What do you mean by continuously?
The example that comes to mind is there's like a science thing that's collecting raw data, and then you need to run a test before you implement a new feature with some of that raw data. But you want it to happen immediately when you do git push.
So the raw data is something that would come in at a future time.
Right, exactly. Maybe
Sure.
that's not a practical example.
I mean, sure, but like you could have like usually what people do is like they have like a nightly cron job, which like dumps the database into some some server, and then you can like copy it from there, or it like puts it into like your S3 or like some sort of a storage, which is accessible to you, and then for your tests you can automatically look at that point and like download the data and
Gotcha.
load your database.
Okay, but you don't have to change anything like in the file. That would be all like I guess.
Yeah,
DevOps
you
does.
do not want to be talking to production from your testing environment.
So it's completely
Right, so
separate.
you should actually have a lot of security here. You should be something like if node env not equal to production,
Gotcha.
or rather, if you do something like this,
Okay. And then exit everything.
like you are crazy sort of thing, right? So definitely have these kind of things.
Okay. So Heroku will never accidentally run your test and then mess up your database.
Yeah. So even if you were to make it as hard as to damage your production database as possible.
Okay.
Any
Any other questions?
Is there a sample way, like maybe with like the FS or write file thing, how you would write a file over?
That's a good question. Let's try to do it together. So how do we do raw queries?
Aren't all queries raw? What's the difference between a raw query and a
Oh, yeah.
non-raw query?
In PG Promise, it just happens to be already wrong.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Only in Connects do you have to do
So instead of raw, I guess, can we do a bunch of SQL statements?
that. Any? I see.
Uh,
There must be some way because you'd have to build. There has to be a way to build a transaction list.
execute query from file. Query file. Reads a file with SQL. Okay, it's probably what we want. So pgp.query file. So have all SQL for users, products, and index. And SQL is it's a new query file. Okay, so something like this. So we will have query file. So let's create a directory called seed. So contacts.sql. So here I would basically have what I wanted here. Right? So this is what you were suggesting, having a separate file. So you could have like, you can organize your files based on the kind of data they're loading in. So this file loads in information for contacts. So I'm just going to have contact information in here. And so in my seed DB, I see. So I could just say SQL.add. Add the SQL route.
DB.none and whatever you set that SQL function to.
So seed DB would just be DB dot none SQL of, where are we? One down. Seed slash contacts.sql. Yep. Return. So this will return a new query file, and I can use that query file and give it to db.none, and that will execute whatever is in the file. I don't know what minify does, but minify parses the file, then minifies the SQL. I don't know, maybe you don't really need to do that in a test. Okay, so we seed the data. And let's see what happens now in our test. So in our test, I remember changing it to initDB. So initDB will reset the DB and then call seedDB. And seedDB should basically load our contacts file. Oops. So path is not defined. We need to import path. So acquire path. So column foo does not exist. Oh. So contacts, there should be single quotes. creating a duplicate query file object for the same file.
Oh, maybe only through the insert statement once or something.
Okay, so it did insert them. But I guess like since we ran the same function 3 times, it's throwing a warning.
Load it once in the beginning and then pass the result into each one.
I guess we could do that. So what we could do is we can say so const seed files contacts is this, and then instead of calling that function, we can say seed files dot contacts, and that'll just do it once. Good. I got another one. Alright, so let's process what we've done so far. So what we did was we required this library called queryfile, which helps us basically read SQL files, right? So we created this function called SQL, and all it does is it takes a file path, right, the relative path, and then it generates the full path of the file. So in our case, we wanted to use this file contacts.sql, right? And the path of this is inside of like this folder called test and seed. So we pass the relative path here, and then it like generates the full path based on whatever we pass in. And then it returns a new instance of this query file function, right? So that's all it does. It returns like this sort of a function which has which probably reads the file under the hood. And then we created this object called seed files, which will which contains like the query files for all the different kinds of data that we have in our system. Since we only have contacts right now, there's only one entry here, but in the future there's no reason why we couldn't have like users, and then we would do something like this, right? And then what we did was we created a new function called seeddb, which just goes in and does db.none, and instead of taking it a string, a SQL string, it takes in this query file instance of query file, which is one of these two, either this one or this one. Either of those are instances of query string. Query file. And we pass that into db.none, and that basically inserts that file into the database. So if I wanted to do multiple files, then I would have to chain this. So I would have to do .then. I don't really care about the result. I would say db.none seed files .users. If I wanted to do even users. If I had a third thing here, just like addresses, then I could chain that as well. So I can keep chaining based on like the different tables I would have. And then also I would have to like truncate all of these here. Right, so these would truncate them in the beginning of the test. So that's what initDB is doing. If I would first reset the DB, actually instead of reset, let's call it truncate tables, because that's actually what it's doing. I feel like reset DB is a misleading name. But I technically don't even need to export this function because it's an internal function. So I only export initDB, and in initDB we'll call truncate tables, and it's going to call seeddb or seed tables. my test, oops, in my test, everything would just be the same. I would just call initDB in my before each, and that would run this resetting, simulating the reset for each of my tests. And I would do this in all my files where I want my test to be reset. All right, I'm going to pause here. Questions?
Is there
Jason?
any advantage of using a query file over just using like fs.read file?
That's what I was.
So the question is, what is the difference between using query file and fs.read file? Well, the difference is that pgpromise doesn't accept a file, the fs file, right? So we're calling the function db_none, and that needs to take in either a string or it can take this query file object. It cannot take a object of file of whatever file fs.read file returns.
I thought fs.read file returns a string.
Right, but it can only accept like one string.
Right, one really long string.
Right, but like in a SQL statement, you cannot pass in, especially with db_none, you cannot pass in like multiple statements. I cannot say, select star from contacts and then select, full name from contacts. This wouldn't work. It can only take in one statement at a time.
Are you sure?
Yeah. You can try it. Want to try it?
Sure.
Alright. Let's actually do this here. Okay. So let's just call truncate tables, right? So it's just going to call this statement. So no data was returned. Or no return data was expected. Okay, so actually let's do insert into
You do db.any.
Alright, let's do insert into contacts. So that's what happens. Oh, something wrong? Oh, 2 right there. Oh, I see. That seemed to have worked. Okay.
If there's \n's, does it matter?
What's that?
I mean, if like in a file there would be like end of line, would that affect it?
So let's see. So let's say if we had, let's try doing fs file sync. So require. So if we had file or contacts file fs.read file sync on seed contacts.sql. Right? So let's make sure we are reading the right thing. So console.log contacts file.
Does read file sync return a string or a stream?
I think
1, 2.
string.
Seed. Alright, let's try to get the full path. Maybe that's the issue. So it returns a string. I guess you can call .to string on it, right?
Since it's synchronous.
Okay.
But you can convert a stream into a string that easily?
It's not a string, it's a book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I guess that works too.
You can just use the node as a file thing.
Say that again?
So you can just use the FS. Is this the thing from Node?
Yeah, this is the node.
The built-in FS.
Where is it? Oh, there it is.
Yeah, but I wonder why they even have this then, query file. Let's read up on.
Maybe they do some internal stuff.
So you can also do like, okay, so you can do like prepared statements and parameterized queries, which you couldn't potentially do with like a regular file. So if I have like, oops. So in my contact SQL, I can put in like question marks here.
If you use their built-in one.
Yeah, and then I can pass in arguments to,
Oh, across an entire file of multiple lines and statements.
yeah.
Oh, that's kind of convenient.
So I could do like seed file contacts, and then I could like pass in like bar and baz, and I would replace those for question marks with the whatever values I pass in. And in general, like, I mean, great observation, Jason. Like, I'm not trying to like say that you can't do it that way, but there is like some additional security features that you get by using using this.
Yeah, it says you can it also minifies and compresses the projection for
Mm-hmm.
timestamp.
Yeah, totally. Although I would say like for testing, I don't know how useful minification would be.
Sure.
Like,
Process overhead versus
Yeah.
space.
right. But yeah, it's cool that you can do it in two ways. You can do it using a file, or you can use it using this query file interface.
Actually, initially what I was talking about was a CSV file loading it over. But,
CSV file?
Yeah, if you just had a CSV file, you would
Into a database.
Yeah, but maybe that.
Sure, you can do CSV files too.
Just copy.
But if you're organizing your test database, you probably don't want CSV files.
Oh, okay.
Just because it becomes a little bit more clunky to insert CSV files. Like you'll have to use the copy command to do it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Cool. Any questions? So everyone gonna do this?
Yeah.
That's
Reset your database for every test.
Search that, truncate everything, promise that all. Clear all the table.
Awesome. Thank you guys.